You're all very welcome tonight to this discussion ahead of the premiere of the new documentary, Poverty, Chasity and Disobedience, Irish Missionaries in South Africa. So these two events are a collaboration between EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum in Dublin, the Irish Embassy in Pretoria, and the Lilies Leaf Museum in Sandton. And we're all very excited to share with you this remarkable history, and indeed to talk with those who participated both in the making of the documentary and in the making of the history itself. My name is Maurice Casey, and I'm the Historian-in-Residence here at EPIC, the Emigration Museum, which is a role that's supported by the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I will be chairing our discussion this evening. So firstly, just some housekeeping. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Zoom at this stage. Now, all of our attendees are automatically muted, and I would ask our panelists as well to remain muted as well while other people are speaking. Throughout the talk, the lecture and the discussion, our attendees are able to write questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the Q&A portion at the end of the talk. So our order of events. Firstly, I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. Then Ambassador Fionnuala Gilsenan will give some introductory remarks. Then Dr. Ciarán Reilly will give a short presentation on Irish missionaries in South Africa. And then we will have our discussion portion, which is very free form and open for the audience to ask questions about this wider history. So let me introduce to you all of our panelists for this evening. Adam Ansal is a freelance South African Irish filmmaker and director of the film Poverty, Chasity and Disobedience. Anyone interested in the history of social justice in modern Ireland will recognise Adam's surname. His father, Kader Asmal, was a significant figure in South African history and a founder of the Irish anti-apartheid movement. Reverend Michael Weider is the Dean of the Anglican St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. He was an activist during the anti-apartheid struggle and remains a prominent voice on issues of justice and equality in South Africa. Sister Anya Hughes, originally from Galway, has been involved in education, development, justice, interfaith and peace work in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa for decades. During the apartheid years, she worked often under dangerous conditions in some of South Africa's most deprived and poorest areas. Father Dick Riordan first arrived in South Africa in 1967 and supported anti-apartheid activities as the parish priest in the Gugulethu township. Deported in 1978, he continued work in Tanzania, Zambia and Lesotho before returning in 1980. He continues his work in the Cape Town townships. Dr. Ciarán Reilly, who will be delivering our presentation, is a historian of modern Irish history at Maynooth University, specialising in the history of the famine, landed estates and country houses, and the Irish diaspora. His most recent book is titled Capard, an Irish Country House and Estate. And finally, I'll introduce you to our first speaker for the evening, Ambassador Fionnuala Gilsenan, Ambassador of Ireland to South Africa, and Ambassador Designate to Zimbabwe, Botswana, the Kingdom of Lesotho, and Mauritius. So, Ambassador Gilsenan, it's over to you. Thank you.
Maurice, thank you very much for that introduction, and maybe just to start off by thanking the EPIC Museum for hosting us this evening. It really is a wonderful occasion. I think we all know that if it wasn't for the pandemic, of course, we'd probably be hosting this physically here somewhere in South Africa, and of course we missed that opportunity. But at the same time, we have now a situation where we have audiences gathered from South Africa and from Ireland, and perhaps from other places as well, who are able to take advantage of the fact that this is being broadcast virtually, and perhaps people who wouldn't normally be able to attend an event like this are able to attend it. So I just really want to thank EPIC Museum for helping us to put this on this evening. We're also very lucky that Lilies Leaf Heritage Centre here in South Africa, which has such an amazing history and such a resonance for everybody in South Africa, because of the role that it's played in the anti-apartheid struggle, is also partnering with us and will do over the next few months as we work to disseminate both the documentary film and also an exhibition that's going to go with it. So this is a really important project for the embassy. In fact, it well predates my tenure as ambassador here. In fact, I happened to be in South Africa when it was first discussed between the Secretary General and the then Ambassador, Liam McGowan. So it's wonderful to see it come to fruition in such a fantastic way. And I think anyone who has the opportunity should tune in again tomorrow night for the documentary, which really is quite a wonderful piece of work. This should also be seen just in the broader commitment that the department has to diaspora and to understanding the role that Irish people have played in lots of parts of the world. And of course, the Irish missionaries have played an enormous role, not just in South Africa, not just in the continent of Africa, but in many places across the world. But perhaps we haven't documented and recorded that adequately, and not to do so would be a huge missed opportunity. These are these are amazing stories. They're filled with people of great courage, great bravery, people with a tremendously adventurous spirit, and people with great resilience. And you'll see from the discussion this evening that those people are still with us today and still able to give us a first-hand account of what it was like to live through this period and the contribution that they made. And it wouldn't have been possible for us in the embassy to put this together and to support Adam and Ciarán to do the work on the documentary and the research if it wasn't for the fact that the department has an immigrant support fund which we accessed, and that has allowed us to put this work together and bring this event to you this evening, the research behind it, and indeed the people who are going to be able to tell their story. So that's all I wanted to say. I don't want to distract from the main event and to take up any more of your time, but I really hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you take the time to come back tomorrow evening, same place, same time, I believe, to watch the documentary. Maurice, thank you very much. I'm handing back to you now.
Great, so thank you very much for those remarks. And now Ciarán Reilly is going to speak. So I'll hand us over then to Ciarán.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Maurice, for the introduction, and thank you, Ambassador Gilsenan, for your remarks as well. I'm just going to share this PowerPoint and I'll begin. I think it's ready to go. I hope you can all see that. So I'll begin. In an open address to the people of Ireland in 1863, Bishop Thomas Grimley appealed for help in building up the church in South Africa. Quote, "From the shores of South Africa, I appeal to you for aid." Emphasizing that his diocese was about 4 times the size of Ireland, but that he had only 5 priests, Grimley sought the assistance in saving, quote, "thousands of poor souls and those of Irish parents lost to our holy religion." A century after his appeal, the Irish missionary community in South Africa was at its peak, with almost 5,000 priests, brothers and sisters working throughout the country. Today, on the bicentenary of the arrival of the first Irish priests in South Africa in 1820, Irish missionary numbers are estimated to be as low as 300. In 2018, the Embassy of Ireland in South Africa commenced a project to gather and record the stories of Irish missionaries who are still in South Africa or who have recently returned to Ireland. It is a timely endeavour, given the fact that in the last decade or so, many of those who were active missionaries in South Africa have passed through to their eternal reward. The Embassy, quite rightly, appreciated that a vital historical record may be lost if they did not act fast. During the course of the past year or more, a vital record and archive of these stories has been gathered and offers illuminating insights into missionary life in South Africa over the past 40 years and more. The story of perhaps one of Ireland's greatest inputs in South Africa that of its missionary sons and daughters, is now being documented and will be preserved for future generations. While individual congregations and parishes have published their own histories, usually to coincide with a centenary or anniversary, there has been little analysis of the Irish missionary experience in South Africa as a whole. This lecture this evening is offered as an introduction to the film Poverty, Chastity and Disobedience, which will premiere tomorrow evening, and also to emphasise that Irish missionaries have played a hugely influential role in establishing churches, schools, hospitals and other public buildings in South Africa over the past 200 years or so. And in doing so, they made a significant impact to the social, economic and political world of South Africa over 2 centuries. In 1820, 2 Irish missionaries arrived in South Africa in very differing circumstances. Father Patrick Scully arrived somewhat reluctantly in Cape Town, making him the first Irish Catholic priest in South Africa. And in the same year, Reverend Francis McClellan, a Church of Ireland rector, also arrived in South Africa when he accompanied the group that would become known as the 1820 settlers. However, these early Irish religious influences were largely unsuccessful, and by the middle of the 1830s were said to be floundering. Arriving somewhat prophetically on Easter Sunday 1838, Bishop Patrick Griffith was somewhat more successful and laid the foundations for the Irish missionary tradition we know today. However, there were difficult beginnings. When Griffith arrived in Cape Town, he found that, quote, in the entire country there was neither priest nor church, and the first masses in the city were held in a police barracks. It was a similar situation when his companion, Father George Corcoran, went to Port Elizabeth the following year and was forced to celebrate Mass in the home of an Irish tailor. However, Griffith quickly got to work and soon opened a school for boys in Cape Town, where with his sister Margaret as teacher, the emphasis was on multicultural education. Griffith is remembered as the father of the church in South Africa, and his legacy can be seen in St Mary's Cathedral in Rowland Street, Cape Town, which was dedicated in 1851. In establishing churches and religious communities, Griffith initially focused his attention on Cape Town and Port Elizabeth, but by 1847, churches were also underway in Grahamstown and other centres. Much of his early concerns and those of his fellow missionaries centred on whether they should or could extend their activities amongst the native population. As early as 1841, Griffith had urged the foundation of a mission to go amongst, quote, the Xhosa people and others, but little came of this plan. However, without the financial resources of the missionary community, the vast geographical challenge that South Africa posed made it impossible to do so. Indeed, for much of the 19th century, these challenges remained a constant. In 1893, Reverend John Allen complained about the problems travelling the vast Drakensberg Mountains, made worse, he wrote, by the fact, my parish, 25,000 miles in extent, is extremely rugged, the most mountainous in the country. It was a similar scenario which awaited the newly appointed Bishop William Miller in 1905, when he was informed that his diocese in the Transvaal covered an area the same size as France. And the foundation laid by Griffith and his helpers quickly bore fruit. By 1863, the year after his death, there were 9 priests, 7 churches, 3 chapels, 1 convent, 1 seminary, 9 schools, 2 conferences of St. Vincent de Paul, a young men's society, a temperance society, 4 libraries, 3 reading rooms, and around 5,000 Catholics in the Western Cape. This was a remarkable achievement, considering that prior to his arrival there were, by his own admission, only 300 Catholics in the Cape. The work of spreading the gospel throughout the second vicariate in the Eastern Cape fell to another Irishman, Bishop Aidan Devereux, who undertook a fundraising trip to Europe in 1847, where he met with great success and soon was in the position to establish schools in Grahamstown. He also brought with him the Sisters of Assumption, who arrived in Port Elizabeth in 1848. The nuns later recalled their arrival in South Africa and travelling in a caravan, or as they called it, a palace on wheels, across a vast and dusty terrain. The sisters immediately set to work, visiting the sick, looking after orphans, and helping the poor, and in doing so became the first Irish religious community to minister in South Africa. These early Irish missionaries also tended to the arrival of Irish emigrants who were fleeing the Great Famine of the 1840s. In Cape Town, Father Arthur McCarthy welcomed female orphans from Wexford Workhouse and those emigrants who had managed to land in the city despite the anti-convict protest which engulfed the Cape during 1849 to 1850. Over the course of the next 3 decades, the Irish missionary footprint in South Africa became much more visible, with the arrival of numerous religious orders. Through Bishop Thomas Grimley's influence, the Dominican Sisters arrived in 1864, and the Maris Brothers in 1867, establishing schools in Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Edenhague. In 1874, the Dominican Sisters, led by Mother Dimpna and Bridget Lynn, opened the Grimley's Institute for Deaf and Dumb in Cape Town. Later, Bishop John Leonard brought the Salesians to Cape Town, the Oblates to the Transvaal, and in 1882, the Nazareth Sisters, who established, amongst other things, an orphanage in Port Elizabeth. By the mid-1880s, when the Kimberley Vicariate was established, the Sisters of Mercy and others had established themselves there. The progress of these missionaries was widely praised. In 1879, Father Walsh in Pretoria praised the Loreto nuns for, quote, the range of instruction they provided, of an advanced character, and the supplies a want long felt in this town. Some of the early education work was innovative, and indeed the first of its kind in South Africa. A remarkable feature of these early schools was that they welcomed children of other faiths. And the foundation of a Jesuit college in Grahamstown by Reverend Dr. Richards helped to increase the number of missionaries, evident by the confidence of Richards to establish the first Catholic newspaper in South Africa, The Colonist, and later a Catholic magazine. Richards was also responsible for bringing the Trappist monks to Marion Hill near Durban. And Trappist monks were brought with them a range of different skills which benefited the native population, including in agriculture and irrigation. The success of many of these missionary projects can be based or traced to St. Peter's College in Wexford, which was undoubtedly the nursery for South African missions in the latter half of the 19th century. Amongst the graduates of St. Peter's was the aforementioned Richards, known as the Roaring Lion, who first arrived in the Cape in 1871. Father John Colgan would write in the 1930s that Richards deserved to be remembered, quote, as a pioneer not only of the Catholic faith, but also of culture in general in the subcontinent. In 1875, another Wexford priest, Father John Allen, left St. Peter's for Port Elizabeth, and before long left his mark on the missionary field. Allen was instrumental in promoting education in many ways, and was responsible for the development of a public library in Queenstown. And on a somewhat smaller scale than their Catholic counterparts, Irish Protestant missionaries also endeavoured to make a difference in South Africa, beginning with the aforementioned McClelland and in 1822, when William Wright preached a Christmas Day sermon in Cape Town. Protestant missionaries also found it difficult to go among the natives, owing to both the limited resources and the sheer vastness of the country. Although in the early 1830s, a Kilkenny man, Wallace Hewitson, a member of the Church Missionary Society, was recorded as, quote, going among the Zulu people. Hewitson met with some success in this endeavour and later opened a school and traded in King Williamstown. And later Irish Protestant ministries were to be found in other places, including Colesburg and Bloemfontein. The Reverend John Thomas Dara arrived in Johannesburg in June 1887, and following humble beginnings, his first service, which was held in a corner store, he quickly raised enough money to build a church, and a decade later founded the prestigious St. John's College. And well into the 20th century, Irish Protestant missionaries continued to travel to South Africa. A feature of the Irish missionary experience in South Africa was that those from varying religious persuasions often came together to help the poor and the marginalised localities. For example, in Grahamstown, support for Irish famine relief in the 1840s and early 1850s was led by Irish Catholic and Baptist priests. Likewise, in the late 1880s, the building of a new convent in Edenhague was supported by members of several denominations. But there was no better example of this collaboration than in the case of Alfred Philip Bender, a prominent member of the Cape's Irish community and the first Hebrew lecturer in the South African College. In 1895, he became minister of the Cape Town Jewish congregation, and working with the Irish-born Anglican minister Frederick York St. Leger and the Irish-born Thomas J. O'Reilly, sometime mayor of Cape Town, he was noted for his philanthropic activities, particularly in education amongst the poor of the city. And in the context of the political role played by missionaries in the second half of the 20th century, it is important to highlight that during the Second Anglo-Boer War, Irish missionaries for the first time began to be more vocal about matters of politics. Those like Father James O'Hare were vocal in their criticism of the British government, and was later publicly thanked by the South African Republic for his stance. However, not everyone was caught up in the fervour or excitement of the war. One Irish missionary despaired of his efforts during the war, writing that, quote, "It will be a blessing when the war is over. The country is a howling wilderness in a ruin. No crops, no vegetation, and all a desolate waste. Sometimes I have to say mass under a tree or a wagon." In the aftermath of the war, the attention of Irish missionaries in South Africa once more turned to education. In 1903, I should say, in an effort to rebuild and bolster the missionary community, Bishop Hugh McSherry wrote to several religious orders in Ireland looking for more missionaries to be sent, although he did caution that, quote, "Everything here is quite different to what it is at home. Climate, season, habits and customs of the people, conditions of travelling, the ways of the natives. Everything is different." But McSherry did succeed in bringing religious orders to South Africa, including the De La Salle brothers to King Williamstown, where they built both primary and secondary schools, and the Maris brothers, who also increased their operations in the country. The renewed efforts of McSherry and others were necessary owing to a number of legislative changes by the South African Parliament in the early part of the 20th century. The first of these came in 1905, when the Parliament introduced funding for undenominational schools, and in 1911 this was followed by withdrawing subsidies where religion was taught in schools. Once more, turning their attention to Ireland for financial assistance and, more importantly, for new recruits, this period marked a high point in Irish missionary activity. Those like the Sister of Mercy appealed for new recruits in Mafeking and Johannesburg, declaring that, quote, "There was no sunstroke or fever to be found in this country." Their work would soon prove highly beneficial, winning praise for their efforts during the Great Flu or Spanish influenza, which hit South Africa and most of the world just over 100 years ago. At the Paro Mission near Cape Town, ran by the Holy Cross Sisters, many orphans were cared for following the deaths of their parents during the epidemic. Now, this new wave of missionary activity in the early part of the 20th century was also characterised by the building of churches and schools, bolstered by the presence of a number of Irish architects who had made South Africa their home in the early decades of the century. These building projects included the works of George Luke O'Connor, who designed St. Patrick's College in Kimberley in 1930, John Francis Beardwood, who designed the convent schools and the Catholic Club, amongst other buildings in Johannesburg, Patrick Bernard Gregory, who designed the Cathedral of Christ the King in Johannesburg, and Brendan Clinch, who designed the Catholic Church in Pretoria and at least 4 different local churches in Johannesburg. Ambitious and scaled, these buildings dominated local landscapes, ensuring that Irish missionaries were visible in all of their efforts. And the most iconic of these buildings was perhaps the Irish Round Tower, located 14 miles from Cape Town in a place called Philippi in the Cape Flats. Built as a monument to the zeal, work and effort of the Irish missionary community, it was the site of an annual pilgrimage on St. Patrick's Day, where the Cape Town Irish Hibernian Society had Mass celebrated in Irish. Indeed, the celebration of Mass in Irish was something that was carried out by other missionaries throughout South Africa during the period. And indeed, even soil from the Holy Shrine at Knock, I should say, in Ireland was brought on several occasions in the 1950s. The Irish missionary presence in the early 20th century was also very evident to the first Irish envoy to visit South Africa in 1921, a man called Patrick J. Little. Sent by Eamon de Valera and the Irish Provisional Government to win support and to further the aims of Dáil Éireann, the success of this hugely important mission in terms of what would occur in 1921 in Ireland depended on Irish missionaries who paved the way for the visit. Not surprisingly, these included a number of missionaries who were also members of the Irish Republican Association of South Africa, including Father Curtis in East London and Father Thomas Cullinan in Craddock. Little was invited to speak, and a number of convents and schools run by Irish nuns and priests, including the Nazareth, Dominican, Mercy and Charity convents, and the Marist and Christian Brothers schools. And the individual success that Irish missionaries had made in communities across South Africa was also acknowledged by others. In the 1920s, the work of Father Thomas Ryan, a member of the Oblate community, was very much publicised. He was known as the Friend of the Lepers, where he worked with a large leper settlement near Pretoria. In 1914, Ryan had begun fundraising for the construction of a Catholic church and a hospital, noting that, quote, "In my parish of Pretoria, there is a leper asylum, and there are over 800 lepers gathered together who need my help." From the 1920s onwards, the work of Irish missionaries in South Africa was championed in the pages of the Southern Cross newspaper, which by the 1930s was edited by the Irish priest Reverend John Colgan, an influential commentator on the missionary objective in South Africa. Such promotion had the desired effect, and in the decades which followed, missionary activity once again flourished. By the 1930s, the Loreto Nuns could boast 12 convents throughout South Africa and had a flourishing community of missionaries, while the Holy Cross Sisters could claim to have built close to 60 schools. New religious orders also sent members to South Africa at this time, including the Missionary Sisters of the Holy Rosary, who were holistic in their approach, undertaking both medical and educational needs as doctors, nurses, chemists, and teachers. The De La Salle brothers expanded their missions to East London and later established schools in Johannesburg and Pretoria, while the Ursuline Sisters catered for the poor of Krugersdorp. The 1940s witnessed the arrival of Franciscan missionaries in Queenstown, who built a seminary there in 1948, while a decade later, native priests also enrolled in training for the first time in Boksburg. Problems of staffing schools, however, continued to trouble some Irish missionaries, although those like the Capuchin order were reassured that they would be real pioneers once they would come to the country. The first Capuchins arrived in Cape Town in 1929, and their story offers an excellent case study into the work of Irish missionaries in the middle of the 20th century. The Capuchins were immediately put to work in the disadvantaged areas of Cape Town, including in Athlone, where one Capuchin noted, quote, "The people seem to want us badly. There certainly is a hunger for a priest here." Producing a map of the Western Cape, the Capuchins were keen to work in areas which were mostly non-white. Moreover, an early report noted that, quote, "all the coloured are moving towards the flats, especially along the main road towards Belvin. And this is where the Capuchins must concentrate their efforts." The mission was an instant success, and just a decade later, the Capuchins were active at Parow, Matresfontein, Athlone and Langa, where they built and staffed schools, churches, friaries and public halls. By the mid-1960s, much of the Capuchin work centred on converts, prenuptial courses and teaching Christian doctrine to children attending the public schools. This was a massive undertaking, laid bare by the report of Father Didicus McGrath, who was the regular superior of the Irish Capuchin mission, who noted in 1973 that, quote, 13 priests and 2 brothers are responsible for 20,000 Catholics in the Cape Town Archdiocese. But a change in the daily activities of Irish missionaries was coming. By the mid-1950s, Irish missionaries found themselves embroiled in the highly charged political situation which was developing in South Africa. Their situation was not helped by the fact that the Catholic Church was viewed with suspicion from the South African authorities and others, who referred to them as the Romse Gevaar, or the Roman danger. As opposition mounted towards apartheid, Irish missionaries who engaged with activists or who ministered to coloured people came under intense scrutiny from the police and the military. Some were subjected to intimidation, and were often removed from their positions, while others were refused permits to enter the country in the first place. As the Capuchins were instructed upon entering South Africa, quote, "If asked, state that you were to minister to whites. It is recommended that you do not state that you were coming to minister to blacks." For Irish missionaries during the following 3 decades and more, their work would place them in immediate danger on an almost daily basis. As the documentary Poverty, Chasity and Disobedience, which will air tomorrow for the first time, indicates, many missionaries were targeted by the security forces for the work they were undertaking with the anti-apartheid movement. Their conscience was tested too. It was difficult to teach the gospel, many argued, when it was being ignored by the authorities all around them. As a result, many chose simply not to abide by the rules which the authorities had laid down. The real strength of the Irish Missionaries project, which the embassy has overseen over the last year or so, lies in the oral testimony which has been gathered by those who were, quote, in the field during the apartheid era in South Africa. Their experiences have now been recorded and preserved for future generations to understand and appreciate their role. Some of these experiences will feature in the documentary to be aired tomorrow night. But if I can allude to just one of these contributors and his experiences in South Africa, can I share with you the story of Father Edward Lennon, who found that his ministry quickly changed following his arrival in South Africa in 1976. As the people of Sebokeng, an area which was part of the Vaal Triangle near Johannesburg, began to challenge the government and to fight for a just society, Lennon and his colleagues allowed anti-apartheid activists to use churches for meetings and other gatherings, including in preparation for the protest marches following the military invasion of the townships in September 1984. With fellow Franciscans, they began to work with leaders of other church groups and other faiths and formed the Vaal Ministers Solidarity Group. The group secured the services of lawyers from Johannesburg to act on behalf of those arrested, and they accompanied the families to police stations and courts. They also arranged a place in the townships for doctors to treat those injured and who were afraid to go to the hospital in case they would be detained. But perhaps most importantly, the Solidarity Group visited families who had been bereaved or who had been mistreated by those in authority. Recalling these times, Lennon notes that that brutality was the order of the day. Our commitment was to be there, to be present, and to support. We spent a lot of time burying people, individual burials and mass burials. These were very emotionally draining experiences for families, for friends, and for us who were close to us, and so many of these people died. Father Lennon is just one of the many oral histories recorded by this project which shed light on the role of Irish missionaries during the apartheid period, and I encourage you to tune in tomorrow night to hear more of those stories. After living and working in South Africa through apartheid, often in very poor and challenging conditions, Irish missionaries have reflected in different ways on their missionary experience and contribution to South Africa. Some are tinged with regret that they were not able to overcome the terrible injustice which they saw and witnessed all around them. For those like Father Joseph Kiley, a Kader Asmal brother, who recalls the student uprising in Soweto in 1976 as an event that shaped the lives of many Irish missionaries, the period was, quote, severely traumatic. In the wake of the uprising, Kiley and others were forced to move and to find themselves, quote, labelled a white racist, opposed to black freedom, which was simply not true, was something he found difficult to accept. Similarly, Sister Mary McAteer, who arrived in South Africa in 1984 during what she called, quote, the dying days of apartheid, felt a great degree of helplessness against the overpowering force of the regime. However, she soon realised that it was her missionary duty to be there, and in the midst of pain and turmoil, she didn't want to be anywhere else. Traumatic though it was to be there, to be with the oppressed, to be part of the struggle was what God had called her to do. Given the social injustice which prevailed in the country, it is understandable that Irish missionaries believe that the greatest contribution over the past 2 centuries has been during that the last 50 years of the 20th century, when they effectively stood with the people during apartheid. Working with the poor and marginalised, as Sister Julia Murphy recalls, made her, quote, happy and fulfilled, and I shared in their joy, their suffering, their hopes and dreams. It is difficult to argue with such a conclusion, but perhaps the final words should go to Sister Maureen Rooney, who gave this assessment of the missionary project in South Africa. The Irish missionary endeavour has been manifold and scattered. There has been no one Irish missionary focus. Contributions varied according to many variables. Many Irish missionaries engaged in formal education in schools of all types, colleges, skills training, healthcare, hospitals, nurse training, clinics, some in social work, with migrants, with refugees, counter-trafficking, prison ministry, etc. The Irish missionaries who remain and are still engaged in all of these activities, although their numbers are now reduced and they are getting older, will continue to help the people of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ciarán. That was a fascinating and detailed overview of the history. So now we're going to enter into our questions and answers and discussion portion of our conversation. So I'll just remind everyone that you can add your questions in the Q&A section in the chat, but also I have the option to allow you to speak even if you are an attendee. So let me know in the chat if you have a story to share or something that you simply wouldn't be unable to type out. Sorry. I suppose I'll begin the questions. I think we should begin asking Ciarán specifically just questions about from the history he just shared there. Ciarán, I was interested to know, of course, in the late 20th century, in the popular imagination, South Africa, and when South Africa was mentioned in Ireland, I'm sure for many people, their immediate association would have been with the system of apartheid. But for an ordinary Irish person considering a vocation in the early 20th century or the late 19th century, what did they think when they heard of South Africa, and what was the appeal of becoming a missionary there specifically?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Maurice. Firstly, can I mention that interviewing the missionary community in South Africa last year was just a remarkable experience to actually hear their stories. These people, although they mightn't realise it fully themselves because they're so engrossed in what they do, they lived truly remarkable lives and have lived remarkable lives and done incredible work. And just to hear their stories and to meet the people, some of the stories very sad, and I think you'll see it in the film tomorrow night that there's one or two occasions the stories that they were telling us actually brought us to tears to hear them. But to answer your question, it's funny actually. Nearly all of the missionaries that we spoke to and have received questionnaires from and who have answered our questions, if given the choice in the 1960s and 1970s, they would have chosen another destination. They would have chosen somewhere else to go in Africa. Some mentioned that they had requested to go to parts of South America. So South Africa and the social injustice was, very much part of the knowledge that they had of the country, but they accepted what they were being asked to do, and quickly got to work when they went there.
Yeah, and another thing then, I think this is sort of a theme that I found interesting in your talk was a mixture of faiths, and you referred to Jewish and these missionary schools that were open to wider faiths as well. And I think that's kind of a topic that our panel speaks to as well, a kind of a notion of interfaith collaboration within South Africa. So either you yourself, Ciarán, or Sister Hughes, or Reverend Weider, or even I know that Father Dick is having some trouble with his tech, but maybe it's been sorted. If any of you wanted to speak then to that topic of interfaith collaboration and the importance of that within this history, I'd love to hear it. Anyone want to raise their hand and I can let you speak first? Yeah, Michael?
Oh, in terms of the Dominican sisters, I come from a township called Altus River. And I remember in the around about 1985, my younger sister was still at a school, a Dominican-run school called Marian High. And the nuns, so they were quite quiet but yet heroic presence of these nuns, and so they would provide shelter, a refuge for my sister. They had a convent behind St. Mary's Cathedral in Cape Town. But I also remember them very distinctly. In August of 1985, there was a big march on Paulsmoor to release Mandela, a symbolic march, and it was routed by the police. Dogs were set upon us. And I arrived late because I was at that time a deacon in a township called Ocean View, which was on the furthest end of the peninsula. So when I arrived, people had assembled on one sports field of a local trainers college, Hewitt Teachers College. And I was drawn in to stand in front of two Dominican nuns. I think one was Irish. And the closer we got, we were able to walk for about a kilometer, and then the police blocked us. And then we were told they were giving us 2 minutes to disperse, but they were not very good with their calculations. So after about a minute, they started releasing the dogs, tear gas, and beating us up. And these two nuns remained. You know, a lot of us ran, but I couldn't run because of their witness, so I remained. And a fellow that joined Umkhonto Wesizwe, which was the armed wing of the ANC at that time, it was their witness. And when he saw them being brutally, policemen hitting them across their breast, that it just flipped his whole understanding of our non-violent protests when he saw the violence inflicted on these two nuns. So that was my first instance as a clergy person engaging with the nuns of that order.
It's a remarkable story. Sister Hughes, I see you're unmuted. Do you also want to contribute something there?
I'd just like to say that when there's a common purpose, people of different faiths actually come together because they've got a common enemy. And I think that was very evident, particularly during the apartheid struggle, that people of different faiths actually came together to work together to overcome the common enemy, which was apartheid. And I think as well as that, I think as I worked in development, we worked with people across all religions. Religion actually did not play a part in who we saw or who we helped. We helped everybody. And I think people appreciated that very much, that we actually did not discriminate on the grounds of religion. So, and I think that was very strong witness in our work during that time.
Great. So we also have some questions now coming in from the audience. So one is from Pauline Conway, and Pauline Conway wants to know, does the embassy or Ciarán plan to publish a history of Irish missionaries in South Africa?
Maurice, it might make sense maybe for me to answer that, would it?
Well, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the first part of this project, and the second part of it is around the exhibition that we're going to put together. So I don't know if we'll quite make a book, but certainly the exhibition and the documentary film together, I think, will be a very strong contribution to that documentation of the history of Irish missionaries. Who knows what else may emerge from this, but I think when both are combined, we really have something that will stand the test of time. Thank you.
Great. And the mention of the oral histories, are they going to be made available to researchers as well? And will they be in an archive? I'm just interested to know.
Actually, we're having some discussions at the moment on how to archive those. We've been having some discussions with the national folklore people in UCD. So we are looking at that, because actually we've gathered a lot of history that hasn't won't necessarily be featured in the documentary, and won't necessarily make it into the exhibition. So that's something I think we need to pick up with Ciarán and Adam and others, but we're open as well to suggestions, because there is a huge richness in what's been gathered. Ciarán may want to say something on that also.
Yeah, it's a remarkable resource, and I think it should definitely be deposited somewhere and kept safe for future research and future generations to look at. I think it's, as I said in the talk, it's remarkable that this has been done, because too often, people are not there to tell their story when people become interested in a subject. Particularly in Ireland, we tend to do commemorations, great, which are 50th or 100th anniversaries of big events. So it's great that this wasn't left to, say, for example, the 50th anniversary of the end of apartheid in South Africa, because many of the key players and the people that we spoke to mightn't be able to tell their story at that stage. So they're recorded, and tomorrow when you see the excellent work that Adam has done on the film, it's, I think, an hour, it might be an hour long. Some of the interviews ran to several hours, so there's a lot of footage there, and a lot of record on film, thankfully.
Great. There's another a question just in relation to the documentary, drawing on from that question, really asking, would it be possible to access the documentary after its premiere tomorrow night? And if so, how? So I guess, Adam, if you'd like to speak to what are the plans for distribution of the film, and so they can reach a wider audience who won't be able to make it tomorrow night and beyond. Is Adam there? Maybe he's having some tech troubles. I'll just wait and see if Adam comes back, and for now I'll ask another question, which is from Elizabeth Hughes, who notes that much of the history of Irish missionaries in South Africa is intertwined with Lesotho. And she notes that we have the great honour of knowing Father Dennis Callahan, for example. I'm wondering how many, if any, in brackets she notes, and Dennis should be one, are in line for beatification. So does anyone know about that? Maybe Sister Hughes, you might know there. You just need to unmute, or even you can take that as another as an opportunity as well to talk about this history of Irish missionaries in Lesotho, because that's not something that I would know about, and I'm sure lots of attendees would like to hear more about that.
There's been a lot of Irish missionaries in Lesotho, and Lesotho is very much a mountain kingdom, which would be very much in a way resemble Connemara, actually, because the mountains, or it's generally associated with Little Switzerland, although technically Little Switzerland geographically is in the Drakensberg. But the Lesotho, it's an extremely poor country. The Irish embassy in particular, I think, has done a lot of work with development in Lesotho. I know that there are some Irish companies. I know that the Irish Pony Project, which was a collaboration between the Connemara Pony, the Irish Foreign Affairs, Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Connemara Pony Project, have strengthened the Lesotho pony, and now it is a thriving tourist industry in Lesotho. The weaving in Lesotho, weaving and knitting in Lesotho has also been started by Irish missionaries. I can't think of the names offhand, but I know there were Irish, not religious, actually there were lay people that started a whole knitting industry in Lesotho. And I think the Lesotho blanket is a product of that. I'm not quite sure, but the Lesotho blanket it's a beautiful work of art, really. And but the weaving, I think the weaving industry, which was started in Lesotho, was certainly started by Irish, not necessarily religious, but Irish missionaries who were interested in developing craftwork in Lesotho. And some of the craftwork in Lesotho is absolutely beautiful. We have a huge missionary presence. Our Holy Cross sisters are very involved in education, in healthcare, and in social development in Lesotho, and would have associations with a lot of these programs in Lesotho that were started by Irish personnel.
Mm. It's really interesting. I was thinking there when you were talking about the parallel between Connemara and the geography of Lesotho, and how much of this history that we're speaking are, in a sense, there are some sort of similar experiences here at work. And I was thinking as well, when Reverend Weider was talking about his specific experience with those nuns and that member of the armed wing of the ANC, and his thoughts on nonviolence being shaped by that experience, what it reminded me of was those parallels with the religious work in Northern Ireland. In many cases, you had priests and nuns on the ground who sympathized with what the communities wanted in terms of social justice demands, but attempted to turn those communities away from violence. And I was wondering, was that parallel recognized at the time with what was going on in Northern Ireland, and in terms of missionary work as well then in South Africa?
Well, I have a history of living and working in Northern Ireland for 14 years. I actually lived in Belfast, but I did all my religious studies and my academic studies in Belfast. So, it's interesting that you talk about interfaith work also. I worked very closely with the Corrymeela community, which was operating in Northern Ireland, and it still operates very effectively in bringing people from the different communities together. And working in Northern Ireland, certainly, I was also one of these people that Ciarán talked about that didn't particularly want to come to South Africa, but I was asked to come to South Africa, and I did. And I do believe now that my experience of living and working in Northern Ireland was a good preparation for the work in South Africa. And I see many, many parallels between being a minority. We were very much a minority in Northern Ireland, and being a minority and being treated as a minority in Northern Ireland. Except I was very lucky. My surname is Hughes, and Hughes in Northern Ireland is a very Protestant name. So they could never quite figure out where I fitted in, except that my accent betrayed me all of the time. In that sense, but being very conscious of the fact of being a minority and having that experience of being a minority, living and working in Northern Ireland, then coming to South Africa. In fact, my first posting was here in Cape Town. And when I came here to Cape Town, I could identify very, very closely with the Black people in the townships in South Africa. I understood what it was, and to be a minority and to be excluded in so many ways from both from education, from social services, from all aspects of community life. So I fitted in very well in the sense of I could identify with the Black people of South Africa and worked with Black people here in Cape Town when I started off.
Fascinating. So I guess continuing that that idea of those shared identities, we should also hear from Adam, who I know is back with us as someone who has a shared South African Irish identity. And there's a question here for Adam, just asking Adam generally to talk about the film, his linkages with Ireland, and how his impression of the missionaries changed through working on the project.
Well, I grew up in Ireland, in Dublin, and we all knew about the missionaries and the missions, and but it's a kind of institution in Ireland. But I didn't know that much about it. I went to a non-denominational school, so I didn't necessarily know many priests or nuns at the time. But the missions were part of Irish life, so we all knew about the missions. But so when I came here, and I met a few. I came here 20 odd years ago to South Africa, and I met a number of missionaries, including Father Dick and a number of others. But I never really knew to the full extent of what they did and the sacrifices they gave to the cause. And so, as Ciarán said, making the film, for me certainly, I gained a huge respect, a newfound respect for these men and women who basically gave their lives to helping others. And I think what was interesting for me was it wasn't just I always thought the missionaries were here, first of all, spreading the word of God, spreading, the gospel. And I thought that's what it was. But actually, they are here to help others and to improve the lives of them. And one person that I spoke to, I did some interviews as well, off-camera interviews, and one nun I spoke to in Johannesburg, she's not in the film, in fact, but she said that we gave people dignity who didn't have it before, and that was quite profound for me, and it was quite an important. I found that very very powerful. That. It wasn't spreading the word of God. It was empowering people, giving them dignity, and so I did gain a huge respect for these people, and the longevity of their time here, and also considering some people came here. Again, I spoke to one novitiate who came when she was about 18, and because she was a novitiate. She was in Grahamstown, which is in the Eastern Cape. She couldn't leave the convent for 2 years because she couldn't go out to the outside world, and she was basically alone. And I can't imagine what that must be like for an 18-year-old to come to South Africa from Ireland in the late 50s, early 60s, and you must feel very alone, and that's your next 50 years or however long you are here, or you get moved somewhere else. But it's I never quite got that was the life and that was how it worked. And, I found it quite remarkable how these people gave themselves to this to helping others, and that's ultimately what it was, and helping them. So yeah, I found that very interesting, and having lived here 20 years, lived in Ireland for 20 odd years, 25 years, I never quite got that, and I learned so much from working on the film, and yeah, it was a fascinating experience, and I grew from it as did the rest of the crew. We all learned a lot from from meeting these people and interviewing them. And when I was cut off earlier, we were talking. You were talking about the archive and these interviews, and we've got probably about 10 hours now, I think, of actual interview, and we also have Professor Donald McCracken, who I see is online here as well, who also has added value to the film and to the archive. But actually, I think we've just scratched the surface. I think that there's probably a lot more that could be done, a lot more interviews that could be done, a lot more stories, and it's an important, it would be a very important archive to capture, and obviously, there is a time limit, so people are getting on in years, and we are running out of time. There's a time limit, but yeah, it's an ongoing project. I think I see it as an ongoing project.
Thanks very much, Adam. So I think we'll now that it seems that Father Dick is with us and able to talk, it would be good to hear about the project from the other side. So from your side, Father Riordan, what was it like when you first heard about the project? Did you think, finally someone's telling the story, or had you been telling the story in other forms for a long time?
Well, thank you. When I first heard about the project, I honestly said, it's about time. And yeah, I thought it was great that this would be recorded. I think because, as I think Adam was saying there, we just followed our call and did the best we could, and in many different ways, it helped the lives of the oppressed in so many different ways. I think some of those who came are often kind of under-reported, like the sisters and the brothers teaching and nursing and in hospitals. They've shown fantastic dedication, no recognition. What the sisters and the brothers contributed to education, and many of them in types of schools that were shacks or straw roofs or no roofs or out under trees and all that sort of stuff. And the sisters who worked in hospitals, they didn't see a penny for their efforts, and they were totally dedicated. So yeah, I think it's tremendous that this project has been started now. Thank you.
There was another question as well from Pauline Conway, asking, did the project look at the role of lay missionaries, for example, Viatores and Christie volunteers? So I'm wondering if anyone can speak to the contributions of lay missionaries in this wider history. Perhaps yourself, Ole.
Just in my experience, maybe Anya may know more. Yeah, most of the time since I've been here, we didn't have, I think, many or hardly any Irish lay missionaries, not, up to the end of the last century. Anyway, definitely. I know other countries had. I saw them up in the, what was the Transkei. In fact, it was fantastic. Especially the Swiss, the Austrian, Marian Hill priests and sisters. They would get married couples who would come out, work on the mission stations, do maintenance with water and drainage and sewerage and electricity, and taught carpentry, taught some of those skills to the local people. It was fantastic. But then recently I got familiar with some of the lay missionaries. I think I can't remember the name. One of them had their headquarters in All Hallows College in Dublin, where I was. Yeah, but I've had very little experience with lay Irish missionaries. Yeah.
If I may come in here, I'd just like to also collaborate with what Dick is saying. Many of the missionaries who came out were actually connected to religious congregations, and mainly from Germany, Austria, and I know from our own congregation, many Swiss missionaries as well, that many of the buildings, many of our buildings and hospitals and schools have been built by lay missionaries. Like architects would come out, agricultural experts would come out. But they were mainly connected to the congregations. There weren't that many Irish that I came across. In other countries, yes, in Africa, there are a lot more Irish missionaries, like Viators Christi and other organizations that where Irish missionaries are working in. I've worked in other countries in Africa as well, and I've met Irish missionaries there, but not in South Africa. I think South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement in Ireland actually educated the Irish people to actually steer away from South Africa for the most part. And that's my understanding, but it may not be correct.
Well, that's when you had the culture, the cultural boycotts and education boycotts. So maybe educational lists didn't come out, and a certain Kader Asmal would have been very strong in not wanting any corroboration or collaboration, during the boycott years. Yeah.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
I think someone in the documentary says that it's, as an Irish person coming to South Africa, he or she became aware that they were white, and so for me as an African, South African living in Cape Town, for us it was just white people. And then I had there was an Anglican priest and white from the UK, and I remember I was 14 years old, Father Fred Marks, and he said something, the bloody English. And I thought, what is he talking? Then I discovered he's an Irishman. And it kind of convoluted my own mind, because it's the violence of ideas that we grown up with. Everything that was bad in our life was white. And even the concept of God spoke English, and it was the faith that we embrace. A lot of my relatives, significant portion of my relatives are Muslim. And I often grapple with the fact that I was in a faith of the oppressor. And then we found the violence of ideas that I'm talking about is, I wondered how, when I learned more about the history of the Irish and your own struggles, so in the documentary, it comes across the affinity, the empathy, because of your own incarnational experience of oppression and of faith and the conflict. And at the same time, when I became more politically conscious, we were becoming the victims of the poison that we were drinking as we fought against apartheid, to how to migrate from being anti-white and being pro-humanity. And we could point to, I don't want to embarrass Father Dick here, but he was often one of the persons we could point to, not doing anything exceptionally heroic, except he was somebody who wasn't black, living in a black township, doing ordinary things, you know, walking the streets. And there were others like him in other parts of our country. When I went to the Eastern Cape, the same thing. And so that kind of also confounded the idea of white hegemony that was exclusively racist. But here we just found people that had an ordinary ability to listen, to internalize, and to respond without grandeur. And I think that for me is, it's the revolution of presence, of people just being there and going about it. And young people then growing up and being associated and then formulating their own ideas about presence and who is there. And I think the missionary presence, I came from a political culture, was antagonistic to missionaries. But when we saw the incarnational nature of their ministry, you know, it confounded us, and it also helped to develop a non-racial understanding of what we were engaged in.
Thank you. That's a really fascinating and valuable contribution. I think that's a kind of a common theme throughout a lot of these histories, and even throughout the comments that we're seeing, this idea of a kind of shared cultural affinity that made a lot of these solidarities seem quite natural or second nature, at least. So Donald McCracken has noted in the Q&A, I just want to read out his response, that the Irish missionary contribution is also core of the saga of the Irish in South Africa. I think it is important as it gives balance to that saga, because not all Irish in South Africa were aligned to the struggle. I think it is important that this project reflects that tension, remembering also that the Irish missionary endeavour among the African population actually started in any extensive, meaningful sense later than other denominations. So Donald wants to say congratulations to Ciarán and the embassy for the work which is being done. So yeah, so this is, I think that there's a lot of that you just brought out there, Reverend Weider, in the kind of tensions when you talked about a political tradition that taught you to not necessarily be initially sympathetic to missionaries. And I actually wanted to talk to Adam about that as someone who grew up a childhood in the Irish anti-apartheid movement. Did the Irish anti-apartheid movement see the church in Ireland as natural allies, or was there more of a tension there as well?
Oh, absolutely. The church was an ally. Father Flannery was the honorary president of the Irish anti-apartheid movement, and then also Terence McCaughey succeeded him, Reverend Terence McCaughey. And now the church played an important role, and church leaders were very active in the Irish anti-apartheid movement in general. Yeah, and I think the sporting side was a little bit more tricky, because that was where rugby wanted to be played. They wanted to play rugby here, and that, as Father Dick spoke about, the cultural boycotts, the economic boycotts, and the sporting boycott. But no, certainly the church did play. They were very active in the Irish anti-apartheid movement for the most part, from what I can remember.
There's a few comments just which are worth reading because they're good. They're not necessarily questions, but worth just pointing out. Jonas wrote, "My mother was Irish Catholic, McMahon from Dublin. She married my dad, who was a South African Indian studying to be a doctor in Dublin. The Irish follow their hearts and believe in equality," and notes that they're looking forward to the film. So that's another sort of example of that kind of cultural affinity. John Finn notes, "Thanks for discussion. This is Father John Finn, member of Missionaries of the Sacred Heart. Worked in Tohoyandu," I'm sorry if I got that wrong, "in the mid-80s and 90s, and did the funeral rite of Blessed Benedict Daswa. Much work done by missionaries on social justice and collaboration with local lay people. The auspices of Sanzine Louis Tricart. I agree that some more, maybe many more stories need to be told and recorded. So yeah, lots of comments like that. And actually just on the comment of that commenter who's looking forward to the film, Adam, when you were away, you missed a question, which is just asking, beyond the premiere tomorrow, how else is the film going to be available to people and how will it be distributed so people can watch it?
Actually, at this point, I'm not sure. I think some of it depends on the embassy. But there's no broadcast possibilities just yet. But I'm sure it'll be put online, definitely. And I hope that it actually will end up in maybe some festivals, film festivals. But it'll be online for sure, definitely. The embassy, I'm sure, can answer that as well as to where it will end up ultimately. The problem with broadcast rights is that there's archive in it, which we have rights only for what we're using it for now, kind of online and kind of limited release. If it's broadcast, then we need to renegotiate some of the archive material. But yeah, it'll be online.
There are some specific questions which I don't know the wider context to, but maybe you can familiar with some of our panelists. Michael Segopa asks, how is Irish House in Polokwane linked to this history? Does anyone know about Irish House? There was another question simply asking whether missionaries from Kiltegan, any stories of missionaries from Kiltegan, from Peter Loughran, any activity by Kiltegan missionaries or missionaries from SMA, which is an acronym I'm not familiar with during this period.
Ciarán's the expert on all of that.
Yeah, I'm nearly sure there were Kiltegan missionaries in South Africa at some stage. I think the list runs to about 27, 28 congregations who were active there. So it's hard to mention them all when you're trying to fly through a quick history of 200 years.
Great. And then there was another question that I had, which is in a way a question about interfaith, loosely defined, which I was interested in, would there have been pushback from maybe upper echelons in the church about collaborating with the ANC in regards to the ANC's political alignments, for example, with the South African Communist Party and a wider socialist internationalism? Would that have been something that the church would have had concerns about and maybe spoken to you activists about?
Can maybe Father Dick or Sister Anya maybe answer that. But just before you answer that, that was one of the questions that I had, or similar to one of the questions that the things that interested me was that all of these people, whether it be Father Dick, Sister Anya, or all of them were essentially breaking the laws of the land during the apartheid years, and how did they did they not have to answer to the Vatican or to Ireland, or how did they sort of but I think the thing was that they just saw the laws as being unjust, and they were helping people. They just ignored the laws. So, I mean, it doesn't quite answer the question, but it speaks to that a little bit. But I think maybe Father Dick can probably answer that a bit about the ANC, about your kind of...
Oh dear. In the 1970s, when I was in the parish of Guguletu in Cape Town, it was impossible not to come across very active youth and underground stuff going on, very much. They were, I think they'd been influenced by what had happened in Mozambique and all that. And I would have helped whoever would have approached us, and many other priests as well. Mike will tell you the same thing too. Whoever it was, you know, people in need, we didn't discriminate whether it was ANC or PAC or Black Consciousness or whoever. I think, as I said earlier, as Irish, we just saw it as part of the gospel to help the legitimate aspirations of people, and later on when I was working in Zimbabwe with the bishops conference, body called Imbisa Refugee. We worked with all of the South African exiles, all of them. We saw them as people, as South African people. It's irrelevant to us which party they belong to. So I don't know if that answers your. And of course we'd be aligned. We would be, labeled. Even by our own church, for supporting communists and terrorists and this kind of nonsense. Yeah.
Mm. And Mike, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, if I could, maybe just from an Anglican perspective, but I think we're all dealing with bishops and institutions and particularly the Anglicans. We're much more an establishment church, and we have a long tradition of non-violence and having a very liberal stance. And often our archbishops before Desmond Tutu often more aligned with the aristocracy or the upper middle class of the UK and the church there. So in about 1986, I was part of an ANC unit, and nothing heroic. I allocated my duty as a chaplain. I wanted nothing else to do, but I also provided shelter, and I never asked people what's in the bag and why only coming back at 1 o'clock in the evening when I'm providing you a shelter. And then the unit got busted, and I could see as people were being arrested that I was in line. Somehow or other, my arrest was looming. And I asked Archbishop Desmond Tutu if I could see him, and just to alert him that, because he had been publicly very strong on non-violence, I didn't want him to be embarrassed with my arrest and to see how I'd be associated. So I saw him. There's a little stream running through the lower garden of Bishop's Court, and I stood with him on the bridge, and so I said to him, "Father, this is what I've done. This is who I am." And I was expecting the Episcopal rebuke, and he hugged me, and he prayed for me, and he thanked God for me. So there was the public persona, and then I think the Desmond Tutu's prayer for me and pastoral response, that was duplicated all throughout the country, either in the mosque or in Catholicism, but the leadership in all its variation, I think maybe we have some regrets now about our intimacy with the ANC at that time, but at that time it felt the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. That fellow that bearded man being dragged there, that was in 19, just after Mandela was released. I was in a Boerland town called Ashton, and there'd been a peaceful protest to Black people wanting to gain access to the whites-only library. and the tear gas, volleys of tear gas have just dispersed people, and I ended up sitting with a group of 4 women and myself, and they came and they told us that we have to disperse. I mean, it's embarrassing. The international press were all gathered around us, and a cop took a tear gas canister, threw it in our direction, and it popped, and a young fellow came out of nowhere and he threw it into all these municipalities have got ornate pools for goldfish. And as he threw the tear gas canister in, up popped, belly up, the goldfish. And then the second round of tear gas knocked us out, so they were dragging us away. And these cops here, the one in Afrikaans, so I won't repeat it, but the milder version of it, this idiot is bloody heavy. That's a milder version.
I'm not sure if you can see, but this is a photograph of Michael being arrested.
Yes, yeah.
Is it on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
My messianic moment.
That's fascinating. I wonder if Sister Hughes wanted to share any stories of the bravery of missionary nuns as well, if any particular came to mind as we were hearing those stories.
Sister Anya Hardiman and those, remember they were marching to Paulsmore?
Yes, the sisters were very much involved in the marches. And particularly pushing very strongly for non-violence. I think that was the thing that I remember, that all the marches that were organized were non-violent, and although very often they were met with violence, particularly tear gas and threats have been taken in. So yes, we were very much involved, all right.
A lot of people simply know that very much looking forward to the film, and of course seeing it tomorrow. Karen Cornell made the point, another one to sort of build a more complex picture, knowing that great that these events are happening, and amazing stories, amazing people with a role in the struggle, and notes Reverend Weider's comment very important, noting also that unfortunately it's also true that some of the most reactionary church people around were Irish nuns, brothers and priests who insisted that there was no place for political discussion in a religious context and were racist in practice. I wonder if Father Dick or Sister Anya wanted to perhaps speak to challenges they faced in converting their colleagues within the church around to seeing the anti-apartheid struggle as the social justice struggle that it was.
My experience was that within the church that the Catholic Church, I think in particular, decided or felt that you could break the system from within, and I think many of the sisters, and in particular, I think the sisters decided that within the schools that they would actually take on the schools, but they would take on Bantu education, but expand it and give people education that would be education for life, and not education that was limited to the Bantu education and to the system. The other thing I think that happened very often was that instead of talking about or talking politics, I think the sisters they acted it. They did what they felt was right, and they started taking in children, black children, into their white schools, making sure that children had that could attend, were actually accepted into white schools, although it was against the law. So they were kind of subversive in a very non-threatening way, and decided to actually break the system from within. I think, when I think of our own sisters, our own Holy Cross sisters, I mean, we started schools in nearly all of black towns, or all the coloured townships in Cape Town. We worked with the Capuchins, and that photograph with the Capuchin priest that Ciarán showed, they were all our Holy Cross sisters that worked in the Cape Flats with the Capuchin fathers. Also in the former Transkei, all the sisters went out into the villages, and they started schools in the black villages with the limited resources that they had, trained the black people and those who had the possibilities also to become teachers. So they gave them training and enabled them actually to begin the process of teaching within their own schools in their own language, because the sisters often didn't have the language. But so the closer people were taught to actually become teachers through actually being mentored by the sisters within the schools. So when I think of the work of the sisters, it was very much more, it was more subversive in a way, in that they broke the law and lived in coloured and black townships where they established the schools. But they didn't talk about it very much. They didn't talk about it in a very overt way as a political act, or it was a non-violent way of engaging, and as Ciarán said, about giving people back, restoring people to the dignity which they felt was rightfully belonging to the people. So in that way, I think maybe the understanding of the Catholic Church, we came into the kind of the thing much later than some of the other churches that were much more vocal. It was only later that when Cardinal McCann and Dennis Hurley began to speak out and become very vocal, that the Catholic Church's voice was heard in the political arena. So the work was there, and I think the work was being done on the ground in a very non-threatening and non-violent way. And later, as I say, it was being spoken about. I think the other thing which I think maybe might be interested to mention at this point is that, yes, the churches, I think all of the churches supported the anti-apartheid movement and the liberation struggle, and the ANC was clearly seen as the liberation movement, and many, and in fact, I think all of the churches were very supportive of the whole ANC. Not that they supported violence particularly, but they certainly supported the liberation struggle, as they did in many other countries. And then what happened, I think, and this is something I think that the church also needs to look at now, is that when the liberation movements then took power in a democratic way, or established a democratic system of government, the churches actually, because they were so aligned, they couldn't critique, and I mean critique, what was happening in government, because a lot of the things that have happened in government, I think this is true of liberation movements, not only in South Africa, but in many other countries in Africa as well, where the church aligned themselves with the liberation movements, and then were not in a position to critique the movements when they were in power. And I think now is a time that I think that the churches maybe need to look at how they can begin to critique what is happening in government, particularly in the ANC liberation movement. I don't know if Dick would like to say anything to that.
Yeah, quite honestly, my experience would be that the church, don't want to generalize, our own Catholic Church and what I knew of other churches, for some sections of the church, it took a long time to, as it were, see the wood from the trees. Because I think Christian missionaries initially came to Africa to look after the colonial establishment. That's how the Christians started. They didn't come out to the missions. And some of them are very slow to recognize this. And so initially the church I think was supported the status quo. And there was a lot of support for discrimination and by the churches in many areas, even worshipping in separate churches and not allowing any people of any other color but white to go to our church schools. We connived with the system for years and years. Yeah, it was, and so missionaries, say from Ireland, were affected by this. It all depended sort of where, as it were, where you were stationed. You could be sent to the middle class or well-off white areas, or you could be with the oppressed people, and other people in the church would call you names because you were messing around with these people. And it's a very mixed bag. I think it took us a long time to see that we weren't always following the gospel. I don't want to say everything. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Well, perhaps that'll be that could be the subtitle for the history of Irish missionaries in South Africa. You could say a mixed bag, and opening up the complexity to all the different contributions that have been made. So I think we are coming to a close of our discussion. If anyone in the audience wants to get in a last question, now will be your time to do so. There is one technical question, which is from, it's been answered, I see, by Epic, which I think was just about if people want to watch this discussion back or send it on to anyone else who might be interested in, it'll be on our YouTube channel, so it has been recorded. And then also to finally say as well, you're still able to register for the screening tomorrow on Eventbrite, so do so if you haven't done so already. And yeah, so finally, I would just like to thank all of our panelists for what has been a really fascinating discussion of a history that should be more widely known. I think everyone in Ireland likes to talk about the Dunnes Stores strike, but I think that this part of Irish contributions to anti-apartheid in South Africa will be a really compelling story for people in Ireland and abroad. So thanks to everyone in their work for both participating in this history and bringing it to new audiences. Thank you.